Frances Claude gazed at her husband seated across from her at the dinner table. She was 48 years old, one of those slender women who looked well in woolen clothes. Her face had a touch of haughty beauty, free of makeup except for a little lipstick applied carelessly. Her husband, Jeremy Clough, was a slender man with gray hair, 63 years old, with a dry, expressionless face. On this night, his face was even more devoid of expression than usual, a fact his wife noticed with a quick, fleeting glance. A 15-year-old girl moved around the table to set the dishes. The girl's anxious glance was fixed on Frances. Frances's occasional frown nearly made her drop what she was holding, but a look of approval made her features relax. In Rosamund Field, there was a certain envy that if anyone were to have servants, Frances Claude would be the most fitting for it. However, she tempted servants with high wages and was very strict about it. Her ideal performance for her servants was evident, but her warm, gentle approval of their efforts, along with her energy and enthusiasm that radiated and influenced those around her, made working in her house a rewarding experience in the eyes of her servants. She had grown accustomed throughout her life to having others attend to her needs to the extent that she took it for granted, without self-awareness. Her appreciation for a good maid or a capable servant was much like her appreciation for a skilled pianist. Frances Claude was the only daughter of Lord Edward Trenton, who used to train and manage horses in the area of Romsley Heath. Those in the know considered Lord Edward's recent bankruptcy a merciful escape from something worse. There were rumors about horses that failed spectacularly in races and unexpected moments, and other rumors about investigations by racing officials. However, Lord Edward emerged with only a slightly tarnished reputation. He reached a settlement with Dante that allowed him to live a completely luxurious life in the south of France. The credit for this unexpected fortune went to the efforts of his lawyer, Jeremy, who went far beyond the usual duties of a lawyer. Jeremy personally provided guarantees and expressed a deep admiration for Frances Trenton. As time passed and her father's issues were resolved, Frances became Mrs. Jeremy Clough. No one forgot to discern her true feelings about the matter. All that could be said was that she made the most of her share of the deal in a splendid manner. She was a capable and devoted wife to Jeremy, and also a dedicated mother to his son, assisting in every possible way to advance and promote Jeremy's interests. She never gave any indication, through word or action, that the marriage was driven by anything other than her free will. In return, the Clough family held great respect and admiration for Frances. They were proud of her and accepted her opinions, but they did not feel a deep, personal connection to her. No one knew what Jeremy Clough thought about his marriage either, as no one ever knew what he was thinking or feeling. People described him as a dry stick. He had an excellent reputation as a man and lawyer, and the law firm he co-owned, Bronskill and Clough, never involved itself in any controversial legal cases. People viewed the firm as one of the leading legal practices, and it was generally believed that its owners were reliable. The firm thrived, and Jeremy Clough's family lived in a beautiful Georgian-style house near the market square, with a large garden behind it surrounded by a brick wall. In spring, the pear trees in the garden were covered with a profusion of white blossoms. When the couple rose from the dinner table, they went to a room overlooking that garden at the back of the house. A 15-year-old maid, breathless from running, brought them coffee. Frances poured a little of the strong, hot coffee into her cup. She commented with approval to her maid, "Edna, it's just right, Edna." Edna's face reddened with pleasure, though she was puzzled by some people's tastes. In Edna's opinion, coffee should be light-colored, very sweet, and with a lot of milk. The couple drank their black, bitter coffee in the room overlooking the garden. They had exchanged disconnected remarks at the dinner table about acquaintances they had met, about Lynn's return, and about future prospects in agriculture. Now, alone together, they remained silent. Frances leaned back in her chair, observing her husband. He was completely oblivious to her gaze, tapping his upper lip with his right hand. This was a characteristic gesture of Jeremy's, associated with his inner turmoil, though he was not aware of it himself. Frances had not often seen him perform this gesture. She had observed it once when their son Anthony was seriously ill as a child, once when he awaited the deliberations of a jury before a verdict, and again during the early days of the war as he waited by the radio to hear the fateful words. Frances thought for a moment before speaking. Their married life had been happy, but it had never been intimate in the full sense of the word. She respected his seriousness and reserve as he respected hers. Even when the telegram announcing Anthony's death in service arrived, neither of them had. Then the collapse came. At that moment, he opened the telegram. then looked up at her and she asked, "Is it?" He nodded in confirmation, then moved forward and placed the telegram in her outstretched hand. They were both silent for a moment. Then Jeremy said, "I wish I could help you, dear," she answered in a steady voice, without tears, feeling only the emptiness and terrible pain. "It hurts you as much as it hurts me." He patted her shoulder and said, "Yes, yes," then moved towards the door, tense and stiff, though with a slight limp in his walk. He suddenly looked old. He walked away saying, "There's nothing to be said, nothing to be said." She felt a deep sympathy for him and was torn apart by compassion as she saw him, suddenly an old man. The loss of their son had hardened something within her and dried up the usual natural kindness she had. She had become more efficient and energetic than ever before. People sometimes felt a bit of fear from her direct, unyielding practicality. Jeremy Clough's finger moved hesitantly over his upper lip, searching anxiously. Francis spoke clearly and decisively from the other side of the room. "Is there something, Jeremy?" He nearly spilled his coffee cup, then regained control of himself. Placing the cup firmly on the tray, he looked at her and said, "What do you mean, Francis? I'm asking if there's something? What could it be? It would be foolish for me to suffocate it. I would prefer you to tell me," she said unemotionally and in a practical tone. He replied unconvincingly, "There's nothing." She did not respond but merely waited for clarification, and it seemed she considered his denial worth ignoring. He looked at her hesitantly, and for a moment, the mask of composure fell from his pale face, revealing a glimpse of intense torment that almost made her utter a gasp of surprise. It was only for a brief moment, but she did not interrupt what she saw. Calmly and without emotion, she said, "I think it's best if you tell me." He sighed deeply and with misery said, "You must know about it, sooner or later." Then he added a statement that seemed very surprising to her, as he said, "I fear you might have entered into a losing deal, Francis." She immediately bypassed the implied hint she did not understand to address the basic facts. "What is it? Is it a matter of money?" She did not know why she first considered money as a possibility. She had not seen any particular signs of financial distress beyond what was normal and expected in such times. The office had a shortage of staff and an abundance of work that was difficult to. It was commonplace everywhere, but it was not unusual. Some of the office workers who had been dismissed by the army returned last month. It could be a matter of illness he was hiding. His color had worsened recently, and he was exhausted from the increasing work pressures. However, Francis's instinct still pointed towards money, and it seemed she was right about that. She nodded in agreement. "I understand. ***, she said, then paused to think. Personally, she had never cared much about money, but she knew that Gabriel could not understand this. For him, money meant a stable, secure world, fulfilling obligations, and a defined place and status in life. As for her, money was a game to be played with. She had been born and raised in an environment of financial instability. Her family had experienced prosperous times when the horses performed as expected, as well as hard times when professionals refused to pay debts, forcing Lord Edward to resort to disgraceful methods to avoid creditors at his doorstep. There had been a time when the family had to dismiss all their servants and live on bread alone for a whole week. Once, debt collectors had stayed in the house for 3 weeks when she was a child, and she had found one of these collectors to be an enjoyable person to play with and listen to his numerous stories about his daughter. If one does not have money, one might resort to trickery, travel, live temporarily at the expense of friends or relatives, or perhaps be helped by someone who lends assistance. But she realized, as she looked at her husband on the other side of the room, that in the world of the Claude family, one does not engage in such practices. They do not beg, assume, or live off others. Conversely, in this very world, one does not expect others to beg, assume, or live off them either. Frances felt deep sorrow for Jeremy, and some compassion because she herself was not particularly worried or distressed. Shielding herself with her practical approach, she said, "Will we have to sell everything? Is the company heading towards ruin?" Jeremy Claude's face showed that she was entirely correct in her intuition. She said gently, "Please, dear, tell me, I can't go on guessing." Jeremy Claude replied with some tension, "We have been through a very bad crisis for the past 2 years. As you know, young Williams ran away, and we had some difficulty readjusting. Then certain complications arose due to the situation in the Far East after Singapore." She interrupted him, saying, "Don't bother with the reasons and justifications. They are of no importance. You were in trouble and couldn't get out of it. I had relied on Gordon, who was supposed to set things right." She let out a quick sigh, showing impatience, and said, "Of course, I don't want to blame the poor man. Losing one's composure in front of a beautiful woman is, after all, a characteristic of human nature, and why shouldn't he marry if he wishes? But it was unfortunate that he was killed in that air raid before he had a chance to settle his affairs, write a proper will, or arrange his matters. The truth is, one never thinks, even for a moment, that they themselves might be killed, regardless of the dangers surrounding them, as one always believes that the bomb will hit someone else." Her older brother, Gordon Claude, said, "I was very fond of him and proud of him as well, but his death, far from being just a personal loss to me, was a disaster for me. It came at the moment." Then he stopped short of completing his sentence. Frances asked him, "Are we going bankrupt?" Jeremy Claude looked at her with a gaze that almost bordered on despair. Despite her not realizing it, he would have found more comfort if she had shouted or shed tears. This cold, practical, and neutral concern had completely overwhelmed him. He said in a gruff voice, "It's much worse than that." Then he reflected as she sat calmly, thinking about it. He told himself, "I'll have to tell her soon. She will know who I am. She must know, and she might not believe it at first." Frances Claude sighed and adjusted her position in her large chair. She said, "I understand. Embezzlement or something like that. Isn't embezzlement the right word, just like young Williams did?" "Yes, but you don't understand me. This time, I am the one responsible. I used trust funds entrusted to me, and I've managed to conceal the matter until now. But it will all come out now, won't it? Unless I can get the required money, and quickly." The shame he felt was the worst thing in his life. How would his wife handle this? She was receiving it calmly at that moment, but he thought that Frances would never display theatrical emotions in such circumstances. She would not scold or chastise him. She said, frowning with her hand on her cheek, "It's foolish that I don't have any money of my own. You have the financial settlement from your marriage, but I suppose that has also been spent," she said absent-mindedly. He remained silent, then said with difficulty in his dry voice, "I'm sorry, my dear. My regret is greater than I can express. I have entered into a losing deal." She raised her eyes to him seriously and said, "You have said that before. What do you mean by that? When you graciously accepted to marry me, you had the right to expect righteousness and a life free of troubles." She looked at him with complete astonishment and said, "What kind of man are you, Jabrim, and why do you think I married you, I ask you?" He paused for a moment and said, "It was always written, my dear, as an example of a faithful and devoted wife, but I can never praise myself or convince you that you would have been able to accept me under different circumstances." She looked at him and then suddenly burst out laughing and said, "What a strange and amusing man you are. What kind of Roman mind do you hide behind this legal facade? Do you really think I married you to protect my father from wolves or from the horse club officials, and so on? I was very attached to your father, Francois. I loved him dearly, and life with him was a great pleasure, but I always knew he was bad at his job. If you think I was ready to sell myself to the family lawyer to save him from his constant troubles, then you clearly don't understand anything about me, at all." She stared at him and felt surprised that a woman could marry a man for more than 20 years without knowing what was really going on in his mind. How could a woman know if the other's mind was so different from her own? His mind was romantic, of course, true, he was well-mannered, but he was essentially romantic. She thought to herself, "I should have understood his nature long ago. Oh, the poor, foolish dear." She said, "I married you because I loved you, of course. Greetings, but what do you see in me?" "If you're asking about that, Jeremy, I really don't know. You were completely different from all of my father's acquaintances. For example, you never talked about horses. You cannot imagine how disgusted I was with conversations about horses and speculations about chances of winning the steeplechase. You were at dinner one night, do you remember? I sat next to you and asked you an economic question about dealing with gold, and you told me, you really told me all about it, and it took the entire dinner, which was a feast of many dishes, as we had money back then and a French cook. I must have been very serious. It was a revelation. No one had ever treated me with such seriousness before. You were very polite, and yet you didn't seem to regard me as charming or beautiful, which drove me to try and show you my best, and I swore to make you take an interest in me." Jeremy said, "You completely captured my attention," and you went on. Frances said, You didn't tell me that. She thought the money was hers forever and that she could leave it to anyone she wished. Well, according to the law regarding dying intestate. It seemed that Francis had not paid attention to his explanation. She said when his voice trailed off, "It hardly concerns us personally. By the time she reaches middle age, we will already be in the grave." How old is she? 25, 26, maybe she'll live to be 70. Jeremy Claude said with hesitation. We could ask her, hypothetically, attribute it to family reasons, couldn't we? Perhaps she is an open-minded, generous girl. We really know very little about her. And in any case, we've been reasonably kind to her, and we haven't been as critical as Adela might have been. Perhaps she would respond. Her husband warned, but we must not give any indication of an actual emergency. Francis said with impatience, of course, the problem is that I won't deal with the girl herself. She is just like a ring on her brother's finger. He is a very disagreeable young man. Francis suddenly smiled and said, well, yes, and I also imagine he is somewhat dissolute, but at this point, indeed, I am also somewhat lacking in restraint. She removed her smile and looked at her husband, saying, we won't be defeated. Jeremy, you must find a way, even if it means robbing a bank.